Welcome to Outside Voices with me, Mark Bidwell, where I talk to remarkable and compelling leaders from the worlds of business, arts, sports, exploration, and academia. In these conversations, I explore topics of fundamental importance to many of us today, both in work and in life, topics ranging from leadership and performance to creativity and growth. Outside Voices has a very clear purpose: to bring fresh and diverse perspectives that help listeners navigate the world we live in. I find stories of leaders who have successfully reinvented themselves mid-career both compelling and informative. This is mainly because I have been on this journey for the past 4 years, and I'm always on the lookout for guides. Chip Conley has successfully made this transition and is now helping many others take the same journey. Rather than being a sage from the stage, Chip describes himself as a guide from the side. His story of going from founder and CEO of the leading chain of boutique hotels in the US, Joie de Vivre, to being essentially an intern at Airbnb and mentor to founder Brian Chesky will be of interest to anyone feeling overwhelmed by changes in their industry or worried about becoming irrelevant in the workplace as a result of technology or other disruptive forces shaping our world of work. As a result of Chip's experiences at Airbnb and the success of his latest book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, Chip has recently launched the Modern Elder Academy with the tagline, "Where midlife mastery is the launchpad to growing whole, not old." In our conversation, he tells the story. So, Chip, great to have you on the program. I think I first heard you talk at the Long Now Foundation, which was, I think, this group set up by the previous guest, Kevin Kelly. How do you answer the dinner party question, what do you do?
Often I pose it back and say, what do I want to be? So it's not about being a human doing, but being a human being. I guess when I would answer that, I would say I help make aging aspirational.
Okay.
which is a heavy lift. Most people don't think of aging as being aspirational, but that's really what I do today based upon my recent launch of the Modern Elder Academy.
And the backstory, I guess, is, you're a very successful hotelier. You sold out in the depths of the recession. Then you took a role at Airbnb, which begun this journey towards making aging aspirational. Is that a fair summary?
That is a very fair summary. I, for 24 years, was a boutique hotelier, started a company called Joie de Vivre based in San Francisco, became the second largest boutique hotelier in the US. But after going through 2 once-in-a-lifetime downturns in the same decade, was ready to get out of that business. When I left that, the Airbnb founders approached me, and I thought that sounded like an interesting way to democratize hospitality. As, of course, you being in Europe, you understand the idea of home sharing it was in the process of growing. I joined them 6.5 years ago. But the thing that was most noticeable to me after I had joined them was like, oh my God, I'm twice the age of the average person here.
Yep.
Over the course of the next few years, in a loving way, I was starting to be called the modern elder at Airbnb, and who was as curious as they were wise. And yes, that led me to writing a book called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, which led me to creating this Modern Elder Academy.
So maybe we just go back to describing that phase in your book. You referred to yourself as the male Margaret Mead amongst the millennials. So your book's peppered with references to anthropology, which, as we discussed earlier, is kind of my background. What did it feel like being a male Margaret Mead amongst the millennials? What happened?
Well, I think I hadn't thought about this. What was interesting is the way that the 3 young founders had approached me, that was that I was this person with wisdom, or actually with knowledge. We didn't talk about the word wisdom. It was more about knowledge about hospitality and leadership and how to create a company and grow it. And so that was what I was supposed to come in to help them with. What I didn't realize was, I'd never worked in a tech company, and I didn't really understand the lingo. And yes, I was in fact exactly twice the age of the average employee in the company. And so I guess I came to realize pretty quickly that I was not there to just be purely the mentor, but I was also the intern as well. So yes, I had, in order to be the sort of Margaret Mead, it forced me to actually, instead of being judgmental, because a lot of times when you're in a place where you feel awkward or not completely comfortable, you may use judgment as a way to sort of get yourself out of that place. Well, I decided to use curiosity instead. And instead of sort of looking at these millennials and calling them names, and I looked at them and said, I want to learn from them. And so that's why I would consider myself sort of the Margaret Mead, in the sense that I think a cultural anthropologist is a very curious person, because they come from the perspective that they are in someone else's habitat in the process of studying that person. So rather than actually take their own personal habitat and impose it on someone else, I was there to actually learn from that habitat. And there was no doubt, being in a young tech company in Silicon Valley at this time of my life meant that I was in their habitat, not mine.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious. I mean, I'm sure there's a bit of, well, I'm not sure, but maybe there's a bit of post-event rationalization in that. I mean, I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but I mean, the moment that you discovered that this was deeply uncomfortable, I mean, was there a point where you decided not to judge, but to be curious? I'm just really interested in, I mean, it sounds like a lovely narrative, but I mean, what did it feel like? And how did you decide to go that route versus saying, to hell with this, I'm going to bail out because it feels like too much hassle at this stage in my career?
It felt bloody awful. I mean, I was going on a hike with my father about a month or so after I had joined, and I was in the process of thinking about quitting, because what I was fearful of, the idea that, man, at 52 years old, having had a pretty good history and success story, I might fail at this. And so I felt like I was carrying a heavy weight. And frankly, it was the weight of all of my past successes and my sense of identity in the world, that I am a successful business person. And I was worried that this new thing I was doing would make me look like an idiot. And because I wasn't sure if the company would succeed, first of all. And secondly, I just thought I wasn't necessarily well packaged to be able to work in a tech company in my 50s. And so what I had to do was go through a right sizing of my ego, which meant, frankly, I was not going to be the person on stage. I was the one who was helping support these founders, and they were getting the headlines. And for someone who'd run my own company for 24 years, that was a little hard, but it was good. It was very good. It was what I needed. I also had to get comfortable with the idea of being the dumbest person in the room, and sometimes the wisest. I was never the smartest. Difference between being smart and wise, but I had to get comfortable asking sort of sometimes really naive questions. If it was a naive question about a word I didn't understand, I wouldn't bring it up in front of everybody. I'd make a list, and then I had some young people who worked with me, who worked for me, frankly, and I would go to them and say, hey, what does it mean to ship a product or ship a feature? What does that mean? I have no idea. So in the software lingo of Silicon Valley, I learned a lot. But I also sometimes asked questions that were sort of naive, but they're really wise in terms of identifying a blind spot that the company had. So I guess I sort of eased up on myself. Instead of trying to think I had to be the wise mentor, I realized I could be the curious or naive intern as well. And once I got comfortable with the idea that people were okay with that, it became a more of a fascinating journey in having a beginner's mind.
And did that require some renegotiation in terms of what your scope and your remit was, or did it kind of evolve in a collaborative way with, I think Brian was the guy you worked closely with, right?
Yeah, they cut my salary in half. I mean, they said, "You're a student. You're not a teacher.
You're an intern. You pay to work here."
You know what? Actually, it was interesting. A few months into it, Brian pulled me aside and said, I don't want to do a formal review for you yet. And I was like, oh, thank God, you're 21 years younger than me. I need a week or two to prepare for that one. But he said, but I want to give you some advice. You're doing a great job. Everybody's loving you, but you feel a little bit reluctant. And so it was interesting. I realized that there was a part of me that had sort of felt reluctant because, first of all, I had planned to just be there 15 hours a week, and it turned out to be like 15 hours a day. So it was a much bigger endeavor than I had planned. But I think there was also a sense of being fearful that I wasn't what I thought I was supposed to be, meaning the person who's just dispensing wisdom. And I said to Brian, I just feel a little awkward because I do feel like I'm learning as much as I'm teaching. And is that okay? And he says, you know what? That's actually why people love you, is because the fact that you're not just sort of like a parent or a preacher at the pulpit spouting wisdom. You're actually in the trenches with people, learning as much as they are. And you may be learning digital intelligence from them, and they're learning some emotional intelligence from you. And once I realized that Brian, as the CEO of the company and my boss, but also the person I was supposed to mentor, he was seeing that this idea of being a modern elder was a good thing for the company. That made me feel like, wow, maybe I can have a role here that actually will be valuable. And as it turns out, that was very valuable.
And so, I mean, it's fascinating because, I mean, I'm, it's a unique story, but I guess, part of the backstory here is that not everyone, but I mean, more and more people are finding themselves working for people who are younger than them. I mean, I'm sitting here in Basel. There's a 43-year-old CEO of a top 5 pharma company, which is different from, a 20-something CEO of their own startup. I mean, this is a mature business worth $250 billion, and the CEO is 43. What's going on in terms of in the workplace that makes you that they encourage you to write this book? 'Cause, I mean, clearly you feel this is the relevant message or story for lots of people in the workplace.
I think what's fascinating is what's happening. It's never happened before in society. Is we're all going to live a lot longer. Now that's been happening for the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we are, on average, we're going to live 10 years longer than our parents. What's new is power is moving 10 years younger. So the average age, and that's why I talk about this in my book, Wisdom at Work, because there's data that shows this. Power is moving 10 years younger because of our increasing reliance on digital intelligence, or DQ. So if we're going to live 10 years longer and power is moving 10 years younger, what we've created is, without intending to, a new 20-year irrelevancy gap for people in midlife. And yes, in fact, 40% of us have a boss that's younger than us. And by 2025, the majority of us will have a boss that's younger than us. So we're living in a world where it's almost like if you're midlife, and in some industries like tech or entertainment or advertising, people start feeling irrelevant in their mid-30s. So the risk here is that people are going to live a lot longer and feel irrelevant a lot earlier. And if that's true, we have the potential for a catastrophe for a life stage that already wasn't well regarded, which was midlife.
Yep.
So my premise is, how do we help people in midlife repurpose themselves as a modern elder so they're curious to constantly be learning what's new while also mining their mastery and having wisdom as well? And then how do we help companies realize that these young digital leaders and who are doing startups, or they're running pharma companies that are worth as much as you're talking about, they could use some wisdom as well. They're often exceptionally smart at a particular narrow area in technology. It's around digital, but they don't often have as much life experience and wisdom around humans and emotional intelligence and leadership. And that is something that, you actually gain over the course of your lifetime. So I think that part of my role in writing these books is to writing the book and creating the academy is to help society and companies realize mixing a modern elder with a young Turk is not a bad idea.
I mean, you make the point, this is a diversity play, and I don't mean that in a simplistic way, but I mean, everyone talks about diversity around sort of gender, but this is around age diversity, which brings out very different things in terms of team working and team effectiveness, right?
Correct. There's so much evidence at this point that diversity is a very valuable element in teams and companies, partly because it helps people get out of groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of groupthink actually means people think quite narrowly and not thinking about all the options that are available. But our focus on diversity has predominantly been focused on gender, race, and sexual orientation. And I've proposed that age should be just as important of a demographic in thinking about this. And there's some actual evidence for this. Young people are exceptionally focused. They do things fast and focused. Older people, when it comes to solving problems, tend to take longer, but they make fewer mistakes. They're also less willing to take risks. So you take someone who's older, who can connect the dots, think holistically, with someone who's exceptionally focused and younger, and you actually build maybe more wisdom, a wider aperture of wisdom.
So some of the skills that an elder brings, and we should also define this, because I mean, an elder isn't someone necessarily with grey hair. I mean, I think you've got quite a broad definition of an elder, right?
Let me define. So elder's not elderly. So elderly is maybe the last 5 or 10 years of your life. Elder is a relative term. Elder is a function of who you're surrounded by. So if I was 52, surrounded by 26-year-olds, as was the case at Airbnb, I was the modern elder at Airbnb. And I believe a modern elder is different than a traditional elder in the sense that they are as curious as they are wise. It's not just about the wisdom.
What are the skills what skills did you touched on it, but let's be explicit about it. What were the skills that you had to unlearn and the skills that you had to learn once you had this moment, this insight talk, with your walk with your father around, having to shift your identity, if you like? What were some of the skills you you had to stop exhibiting and some of the ones you had to learn?
Well, I think there are four key lessons that help evolve someone into a modern elder. The first lesson, and I write about this in my book, the first lesson is evolve. And evolve basically means you need to strategically edit what is working and what's not in your life. And for me, what that meant was like, okay, there's some of my knowledge historically, which wasn't all that valuable in the world of home sharing. It doesn't really matter how many rooms a maid cleans in an 8-hour shift in the world of Airbnb hosts or Airbnb as a company. So some of my knowledge I had to just sort of let go of. And some of my identity, like being the CEO of my own company, I had to let go of. So to evolve, basically the first lesson is in essence saying, be open to having an identity and knowledge that is constantly being renewed. Second lesson is about learning. Instead of actually going into the workplace, focusing on how do I actually give all my knowledge or wisdom away, instead focus on what it is you don't know yet. If you are someone who has lost your sense of curiosity or willingness to learn, you are definitely in the process of dying. And yet we see some of the people who are most alive in their 90s are people who are genuinely curious.
Mm-hmm.
So the second lesson about learning, for me, that meant, having to be open to being, someone in an industry, technology that I had no knowledge of.
And Drucker you quote Drucker in your book as being a great example of that, right?
Peter Drucker lived to his mid-90s, and every 2 years he would study a new subject that had nothing to do with being a management theorist. And, he wrote 2/3 of his 40 books after the age of 65. And he basically was somebody who just saw curiosity as an elixir for life. So that's the second one. The third lesson is collaborate. And this is where we start getting into more of our comfort zone. As we get older, our emotional intelligence tends to grow,
mm-hmm.
which means that we actually have pattern recognition, understanding ourselves and others. And that pattern recognition means that we understand how humans work. And in the context of teams, that's going to be very valuable. Because one of the things that I learned at Airbnb was like, oh my God, there's a lot of smart people in the room, maybe too many smart people in the room, maybe too many smart people in the room trying to be smart in front of each other and competing with each other. I have a role here. I'm the collaborator. I'm the one who brings these people together. And so that helped me to actually be very valuable because, even in a tech company, which is focusing on something that doesn't sound very human-centric technology, it's filled with humans.
Mm-hmm.
And being the one who knows how to collaborate helps. And that finally brings to the fourth lesson, which is to counsel. There's no doubt as you get older and hopefully wiser, more people will be drawn to you because they see you as someone who can offer them some wisdom. And yet I see that as the fourth lesson, because I think if actually you go straight to that first as an older person, you haven't necessarily earned the credibility of the people who you're going to be lecturing. And I think lecturing people is not what you want to do as you get older. I think what people want, asking great questions and welcoming people to learn from you is great, but it's not something you impose on someone.
And I think you used a distinction being a sage from the stage or a guide from the side. That's the kind of language you use, which characterizes that, I guess.
Yeah. I think, again, being able to sort of be arm in arm with someone that you're going to help teach. But I think it's, more than anything, it's about mutual mentorship. The way we thought of, wisdom in the past is there was an older person and a younger person. The younger person was the apprentice. Today, and 20 years ago, Jack Welch, who was CEO of General Electric, created something called reverse mentorship because he knew his senior executives at GE needed to learn from young people. Today, I think it's really about, and it was specifically about the internet and computers.
Mm-hmm.
But today, I think it's mutual mentorship, which means that you could have someone you're mentoring, but they're going to actually mentor you as well. There are things that they can teach you. And this idea is really new because of how much value we give to digital intelligence. And generally speaking, younger people have more digital intelligence than older people.
Yeah. So I'm curious. A lot of my world, my background has been in large organizations, and this whole, often the need to do this is forced upon one, either because of, restructuring or cutbacks, or I think from your point of view, even though you're an entrepreneur, you had a kind of a life-altering, I think a flatlining experience. Just, how can people get in front of this rather than having a really challenging wake-up call? Other things that people can do to actually get in front of this and avoid the pain associated with those kind of wake-up calls?
Well, I think, first of all, if you are naturally curious in your life and you try to almost think of that as a skill that you're going to build as you get older, I think that's that's a really good starting point.
But in the absence of that, because I mean, lots of people say that, but in practical terms, you get into your ruts, you kind of into your routines, and curiosity isn't always valued in process-driven organizations, right?
No, it's not, but it doesn't mean you can't be curious.
Okay.
I mean, yet you're right. In a process-driven organization, efficiency rules. The gods of efficiency do not like curiosity. Curiosity is not an efficient way of thinking because curiosity sort of opens up possibilities. That doesn't mean you can't, on your own, even if it's in private, focus on your own curiosity. I mean, like I said with Drucker was focusing on a new subject every 2 years that had nothing to do with being a management theorist. So he could have been a very process-oriented organization, but that's his way of, in essence, exercising his mind. So I'm not saying that you have to do this in your day-to-day work environment, especially if it's not prized. But the truth is, you do need to get better as you get older of being able to develop environmental mastery, which basically means you understand what habitats you will flourish in. And if you're in an environment where you want to be curious and the environment is not naturally curious, then you may find that there's a better environment out there for you elsewhere. But I would say that's one thing to do. I think another thing to do, to more practically speaking, like in the workplace, especially in a very process-driven place, how could you find someone younger than you, assuming we're talking right now to people in midlife, let's say people in their 40s or 50s, is there somebody who's a generation or even two younger than you that you could create a mutual mentorship relationship with? And I'm not suggesting you go up to somebody who you've met in one meeting and you've heard them talk and they sound sort of smart and you just sort of say, can you be my mutual mentor? It's like popping the M question for marriage a little too early.
Yeah.
No, instead, go spend half an hour with them having tea or coffee and just sort of without any expectation of it growing into some kind of mutual mentorship. And the truth is that with all of the mentors that I had in Airbnb, I would say 80% of the time we never used the M word, but it was just, somebody who I learned from them, they learned from me. And we sort of had an ongoing cadence of having a few minutes with each other every once in a while. So I think doing that and creating that kind of mutual mentorship relationship in your life will serve you well in terms of not only building relationships with a bunch of other people, younger people in the company, but also teach you a few things.
So then, I mean, going from Airbnb, you founded the academy to essentially teach people some of these skills and help them, I won't say reinvent themselves, but certainly help them. Well, I'll use your language. I mean, a pit stop, a midlife pit stop versus the old model, which is fueling up through university and for a one tank journey, if you like.
Yes. So we talk about lifelong learning, and we have precious few places where people can actually get that. Now, online, there are more and more places to do it, but you can feel pretty lonely online as someone in life trying to learn something new. The social crucible of a place where you can actually feel curious and dumb at the same time as feeling appreciated, it doesn't exist. So what was curious to me was we have a growing need, I believe, in the workplace for modern elders, but we have no place where we mint them like we mint coins. So I wanted to create the world's first midlife wisdom school to try to do that. And we started it with a beta program for the first half of 2018. Got a lot of lessons from that. And then we opened to the public in November 2018. And we're just finishing our academic calendar year now. And we've had, 500 people go through the program at this point from 17 countries, a number of people from Europe. And it's been phenomenal in terms of like, oh my God, the overall satisfaction level is way above what I thought it would be. But what's most interesting to me is the sense of connection people feel at a point in life where, frankly, people are pretty silent about all of the things that they're going through in midlife. And this is a place where people come together with a group of 16 to 18 people for a 1-week program on a beachfront in Mexico. And they get vulnerable and frankly, they learn from each other.
Wonderful. And I'm really interested. Your profile is you're an entrepreneur. I just wonder, do you see people from a more structured corporate environment finding this journey easier or harder than perhaps an entrepreneur? Any trends there? And I'm kind of projecting my journey a little bit onto this, which maybe is the wrong thing to do.
No, it's okay. I think it's hard. I think the more you've been in a structured environment where the hierarchy has historically been old to young, meaning power rests with the older people, to be in a world today where power is moving to young people quickly feels like, wait a minute, I'm paying my dues. I'm now getting to the age where I'm supposed to be the one in charge. And I now have a boss who's 10 years younger than me. What happened here?
Yeah.
And I think that's, in fact, I think part of the reason why the millennial generation gets a bum rap from society is because we envy them, because they grew up with the dominant technology in their young years as something that they could use that's valuable for them now, because they learned the internet, they learned computers at a very young age. Whereas, I don't know about you, but my dominant technology I grew up with was television, and it didn't do much for my career. So
No, I'm the
I
same.
I think the more structured of an environment we're in, the more the free floating kind of world we are moving into, where everybody's an entrepreneur and all companies are trying to be tech companies, is confusing and confounding. And it requires a bigger leap to move to a place where you're able to be relevant in this new world.
Yeah, got it, got it. Well, let's make a quick leap now. Can we talk about festivals? This is getting into the anthropology piece. I mean, I'm really interested in, where does your sort of passion for festivals come from, and what attracts you to them? And because I think you founded a business around festivals, didn't you, or a website at least?
Yeah, I started, first of all, I've been going to festivals of all kinds for a long time. When I sold my company Joie de Vivre and had some time off before I joined Airbnb, I got curious about the fact that I was on the board of an organization called Burning Man, which is a festival in just outside the U.S., out of California, in Nevada. It's sort of an arts festival in the desert that's sort of famous. And I was like, why is it that there's a growing interest in festivals in the world, which are basically an in real life experience, at the same time that we're getting more digital? It's like, the more digital we get, the more ritual in person we seem to need. And so I decided to go around the world to study festivals of all kinds, and went to 36 festivals in 20 countries, religious pilgrimages to music festivals, to arts and cultural festivals, to food festivals, film festivals as well. And then created this website, Fest 300, with the co-founder, and ultimately merged it with a company called Everfest. And but I had to really step away from it as soon as the Airbnb founders came along, because that required all my time. But I think the idea that collective, Emil Durkheim, sociologist, defined this as 115 years ago, as actually 110 years ago, he defined it as collective effervescence. The idea that when you're in a place where people have a common mission or common purpose, your ego starts to evaporate and your sense of common joy or collective effervescence grows. And I think that's a really interesting metaphor for many things that work in life. When you are in a place, where even in a company, or frankly at the Modern Elder Academy, where when your sense of separation seems to actually start to evaporate, and you feel this sense of common purpose and common joy. That's why people go to festivals. That's why people love being in a company where it's working well. That seems to be why the Modern Elder Academy has become so popular.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the anthropological piece around, I mean, so Durkheim, as you talked about, as a sociologist, I mean, rituals seem to be, well, I mean, there's a ritual associated with transitioning, out of an organization to reinvent oneself, to reappear in a different, state. I mean, that's basically been that's one way, that's one interpretation of your journey, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that we don't really have rituals in midlife. So society has created, over the course of thousands of years, rituals during periods of people's lives when they're going through transition, whether it's puberty or moving into adulthood or getting married, having babies, or dying. We have actual rituals. We have celebrations that help people through those times. We don't have that in midlife, because midlife is a relatively new phenomena in the history of humankind. And so I believe that, creating some ritual, creating some, in our case, the Modern Elder Academy, a place where people can have ritual around midlife, is a very valuable thing for society, as well, of course, the individuals in society. And because without ritual, without that sense of sort of community support, going through a transition can be really difficult.
Absolutely, and I guess, I suppose, the academy is providing, to some extent, some rituals associated with that transition.
That's right. I would just say that I can't go into the details of each of these rituals, but the rituals are really meant for people to understand what it is that they're leaving behind and what they're moving toward. Rites of passage as a premise, and you know this because of your anthropology background. Arnold van Gennep sort of like popularized the idea of it, having studied indigenous societies. There are three phases to it. There's the severance from the past, there's this liminal period of transition, and then there's this going back into society. And that kind of three-step thing is part of what a ritual is meant to do. part of what the academy is doing. Part of what, frankly, in the U.S. we call, going to military boot camp is if you're going into the military, you leave your family and society, you go and you get your hair shaved, and you go to this boot camp environment, which is this liminal period. And then you're on the other side of it. When you're finished with your military, you've got a new discipline or a new whatever, that you have from that experience. And that kind of hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell called it, speaks to many things in life, but we don't think of midlife that way. And I'm trying to help people see it. That's a good way to look at midlife.
Yeah, although the sort of cliche of the midlife crisis of the sports car and the young partner, and then then getting over it and then reappearing. I guess that's an example of it, even though it's not actually ritualized per se or not embraced per se by mainstream society.
Yeah, I would say, because I don't think that that's a ritual that's society sanctioned or society supported. I don't think it's a ritual. I think it's a way of operating, way of being in
the absence of rituals.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you could go out and drink yourself silly as another approach, but that isn't necessarily, I don't know, maybe at a UK soccer match. That's
yeah, well, sadly. So, are there any companies that are, embracing this, that are putting in place these rituals? I think you mentioned Procter and Gamble have, or, that are recognizing this new reality of demographics and purpose and learning. I mean, are any companies that are doing this really well in your experience?
Well, Airbnb is now. Just because they stumbled upon it. So I think it's sort of two sides of it. There's older companies like Procter and Gamble that have created a mastery society for their older workers to actually sort of help figure out how someone's developed mastery and that how they share it. That's an older company figuring out how to offer that to younger people. And then there's an Airbnb and some tech companies. There's a company called Atlassian. That's an Australian company, large software company that's doing this as well, where they're figuring out how to actually share this older wisdom, because these tech companies don't have a lot of older people. How do you take that wisdom and apply it to younger people and then have it go in both directions? But it's a relatively new phenomena. So I can't say there are a lot of companies that are the role models yet.
Yeah. And I guess, I think I remember you saying in the Q&A that, you'd had interest from corporates to running the academy programs in-house, but it's early days, is it?
That's right. Yes, we've had a lot of interest from companies that would like to have to come to the academy and bring their teams. We've already had companies that have done that, and we now have companies who are actually sending people in midlife to go to the academy as a way of renewing themselves.
Interesting. When I came across your work, it just resonated, on a number of levels with me and the kinds of people I work with, the kinds of organizations I work with, because there is clearly a need for this, and there seems to be very little available to help people on this journey.
Well, that's what's phenomenal. I think that 40 years ago, we've had spas and health retreats probably for a long time, but it's been 40 years since something called Canyon Ranch was created as a destination spa resort to help people, often in midlife, figure out how to get back into their bodies. Similarly, I think it's time for us to help people in midlife to get back into our hearts and souls about what it is that we're here on earth to do. Until the Modern Elder Academy came along, there really wasn't a place that was dedicated with a curriculum specifically for people in midlife.
Yeah, lovely. So, mindful of time, Chip, a couple of questions I sent through to you recently. Apologies for not getting them out to you earlier. First question, what have you changed your mind about recently?
Well, I think I've changed my mind about the idea that aging can be aspirational. I don't think aging was aspirational in my perspective in the past, and I'm actually starting to imagine maybe it is. The U curve of happiness, which shows that people get happier as they get older.
Unless you're Russian.
Unless you're Russian, exactly.
Can you just say a bit more about that? Because this is I love this concept, and maybe you can just describe it a little bit.
Sure. So, social scientists pretty much across the world, except for in Russia, have found that as people age, they get happier. And it's a surprise because the societal narrative is quite the opposite. As you go to midlife, you have the midlife crisis, and then you have disease and decrepitude after that. But in fact, people do get happier, and it's for a variety of reasons, generally around the idea of moving from the accumulation part of their life to the editing part of their life. And when you move into an editing mode, you start focusing on that which is important to you. It also means that there's a lot of responsibilities that tend to happen up to about age 45 to 50 that you start to evolve out of, which means you have a little bit more freedom. You also you're less worried about what people think of you and what society expects of you. You've sort of gotten over the disappointment of the things that didn't happen the way you wanted them to. And very much you start focusing more on the moment. People, as they get closer to their death, which, if you're 50 years old, maybe a long time from now. But as you get older and closer to your death, you actually are less focused on the future. You get more focused on the present. And when people move into that place of the presence, they tend to into a more content or happier place. So those are all the reasons. So yes, I think my key lesson is aging can be aspirational. Although if you are playing on the playing field of youth, which is your body, you will constantly be having an uphill climb because it's harder to keep that body in shape and your face looking like it did when it was 20 years old.
Yeah. Okay. So, and when you say presences, is that plural? I think you used the word presences, didn't you? Or was it?
I said being in the present moment. Yeah. So it's interesting. When you are in the present moment, you have presence.
There you go. Okay. Excellent. I got it. Presence. CE then.
And it is a gift, like a present as well. There's 3 meanings there.
Lovely. And then second question, where do you go to get fresh perspectives, especially when you're facing tough challenges?
We all have to know, where do we get renewed and what are the places that just feel fresh to us. For me, it's running on a beach. When I'm running on a beach, I don't care what's happening to me during the 30 minutes that I go for that run on the beach, it feels like I'm renewed. So often when I am most in need of some rejuvenation or a shift in how I'm looking at things, I'll go for a run on the beach. And then I feel like I get a download from the heavens of different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, because I read that you're a great fan, as I am, of Viktor Frankl's work, and that struck me as being a wellspring that many people go back to when they're facing challenges. But like you, I guess, like me, you reach for the physical exercising route as well.
Well, yeah, I there's no doubt. There's a lot of great books out there that do it for me as well. But Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, has always been an inspiration. If nothing else, for those who don't know the book, it's about a psychologist in a concentration camp, in World War II. And if you think you're having a bad day, week, or year, read that damn book. You'll realize that your problems are petty compared to what Viktor Frankl and people in concentration camp had to deal with.
Yeah. And a quick aside, I mentioned to a friend of mine today that I was interviewing you, and she was terribly excited. And I said, "What do you want me to ask, Chip?" And she said, "What are you reading at the moment?" So let me ask you that question, Chip.
Well, there's a book I love from the UK called The 100-Year Life, which I just...
From Linda Grattan.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, they were on your show, I think. I read that book a year ago, and then I read it again a month ago. And in rereading it a month ago, there were things I didn't see the first time. So I love that book because it really says if it is true that about half of the people in Europe or the UK who are being born today are going to live to 100, we need to really rethink how we structured our lives and society. Another book that I'm just starting to read right now is called Elderhood by a woman named Louise Aronson. So it's very interesting that the word elder is starting to proliferate out there. This is now a New York Times best-selling book. So the idea of elders is catching on. What else am I reading? I just read a book by a guy named Mel Zuckerman, who created Canyon Ranch, and it's called The Restless Visionary. So it's a really sort of a personal tale of him. So yeah, I have so many books. I love reading.
Lovely. Well, that's one of the joys of doing this podcast. I get lots and lots of stuff sent across to me, so I'm never wanting for a good read. But thanks for those. So you'll be thrilled that that I managed to get the question in. So my final question: what's your most significant failure or low, and what have you learned from it, and how have you applied that learning?
Well, I think I've had many. Which one should I choose? I think one of my lessons was we created a boutique campground 7 years before the word glamping was created. Mm-hmm. And this is basically a place where people could come and, without getting their hands dirty, hang out in nature and in a tent that had already been created for them with, a down comforter and a mattress, etc. It was very nice, but it was way ahead of its time. And in retrospect, it failed, and I ended up having to sell it for, a big discount on what we had invested into it. And yet it absolutely taught me something about what people's changing habits are around group corporate travel. People would come and want to do yoga retreats there. This was 20 years ago, at a time where we never imagined corporate travelers or groups of corporate guests would want to do yoga retreat. Ultimately, it led me to creating something called the Hotel Vitale in San Francisco, which became the most successful upscale hotel in San Francisco. So a failure led to a success. And I guess that's really the key message here is, the lessons I've learned from my failures, and there's a lot of them, have led to some of my biggest successes. And including, I could go back to what we started with, is the first month at Airbnb, I felt like a failure because I didn't understand this new world I was working in. And yet being open to acknowledging my sense of failure and my sense of having to be in a new space, and having to renew myself in a new way, helped me to get to a place where I could become a modern elder. So out of what felt like failure, I was able to create success.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I must say, I having discovered your work, I will follow the Academy. If it ever comes to Europe, please let us know. Now, where can people get in touch with you, Chip?
So they can find me on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. LinkedIn, I have a bunch of articles I've written, so you could find some of my articles there. And then there's a website, chipconley.com. And attached to that, the Conley spelled Conley. Attached to chipconley.com, you will see the modernelderacademy.org website.
With some lovely pictures. And it really does look hugely compelling, not just content-wise, but also, the surroundings look really beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Chip, thank you very, very much for your time. I have been looking forward to this for some time. Really appreciate it. And look forward to meeting you in person one of these days.
Beautiful. I love that as well.
Great.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by Outside Lens, a business that brings you fresh and diverse perspectives that help you navigate the world we live in. For more information, go to www.outsidelens.com, where you can find details on this and many more podcasts that I've done with remarkable leaders over the years. If you found this episode particularly valuable, please share it on social media. I hope you enjoy my work and feel free to let me know what you think, either contacting me on LinkedIn or emailing me at mark@outsidelens.com.